Good morning, Dan and Amy, and we're pleased to be joined by our next guest, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He is also the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and is the author of the new book, Directorate S, The CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some rather startling assertions, revelations in Mr. Coll's book about America's efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, including the CIA's work with ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency, and how the approach that we took during the last 16 years of Bush and Obama undermined in a material way the efforts that were being made by troops on the ground to eradicate the Taliban and other terrorist elements. Steve Coll, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So just give us a perspective on how you put this book together, your time researching and kind of piecing this puzzle together.
Well, it's sort of a 10-year project. I was out there a lot as a reporter, really going back decades when I was first assigned out there as a newspaper correspondent. And the Pakistani intelligence service was always a source of fascination because it seemed so central to the wars in Afghanistan. When I was first out there, we had collaborated with ISI to run guns and money to the Afghan Mujahideen to defeat the Soviet occupation, which was successful, but it also seeded the Islamic extremism that ultimately gave birth to Al-Qaeda and 9/11. And then, on September 11th, we knew well what Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban was. They openly supported them. We famously said, you're with us or against us, and they decided to abandon their clients and fight the war with us in the fall of 2001. But then gradually, after the Taliban were expelled from Afghanistan, ISI kind of went back to its old playbook and kind of ran the same program against us in Afghanistan that through the Taliban that we had run with them against the Soviets. So. And we were remarkably slow to recognize what was going on. We kept thinking that maybe they were cooperating with us and that they were just helpless in the face of the Taliban's comeback. Eventually, I think we did, toward the end of the Bush administration, come to terms with what they were doing, but then it was difficult to persuade them to change what they had long seen as their policy, their interests.
Just to rewind for a second, I want to go back to what you said before about our efforts to arm the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And, of course, this became somewhat celebrated, and perhaps the history has become a bit stylized by George Krill's book, Charlie Wilson's War. And one of the takeaways at the end of the book, and even more sensationalized in the movie, is this idea that the real failure, America's real failure in Afghanistan after the Mujahideen had repelled the Soviets was that we didn't continue the funding to build the infrastructure in Afghanistan that would have stabilized that country. What you're suggesting is, I think, no, that's not really it.
Well, it's a lesson a lot of people took away. Even in the Bush administration, when the war got bad, people like Bob Gates, who had been around in the Charlie Wilson's War era, said, well, we can't abandon this place again because we did that once and we got 9/11 as a result. I think, there was probably no way that the United States, even if it had stayed involved after the Soviet troops left, could have stabilized that war. It was the Civil War started almost the day the Soviets pulled across the bridge. Probably the opportunity we had to do better was after we threw out the Taliban government in December 2001. In early 2002, 2003, Afghanistan was peaceful. The whole world was united around what we had done, and the Taliban were beaten. But we didn't consolidate that victory, and the Taliban came back. I think ISI was the biggest factor in the war. They saw us going off to Iraq. They basically said to themselves, this is our neighborhood. The Americans are finished here. We better get back to protecting our own interests. And so the Taliban comeback was part of their response to that.
Obviously, the U.S. has been at war in Afghanistan for all these years, but the U.S. has way more at stake across the border in Pakistan. Can you explain?
That's been a big conundrum in the war. Pakistan has a population that's 10 times larger than Afghanistan, and it has 100-plus nuclear weapons. And when we first went into Afghanistan after 9/11, the Bush cabinet sat around and they said, well, what's the worst thing what do we really have to guard against? What's the nightmare scenario? And the answer was, we don't want Pakistan's nuclear weapons to fall into the wrong hands, so we've got to be careful not to destabilize Pakistan. And by the time you get to the bloody years of the Taliban war, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, when we contemplated putting pressure on Pakistan, saying you got to stop supporting the Taliban, the problem was Pakistan had become so unstable itself. It was suffering the worst terrorism in its history, car bomb attacks all over the major cities, that the Americans said to themselves, if we go in and pressure them too much, we're going to get that nightmare scenario. We're already worried that their nuclear weapons could fall into the wrong hands. And so, in a way, Pakistan's own failure, its own instability, prevented us from putting the kind of pressure on them that we probably would have if they didn't have nuclear weapons.
You cover this in the book, but perhaps provide a little bit more detail than what we kind of understand or intuitively believe to be true about Pakistan's role in providing cover for Osama bin Laden's stay in Abbottabad. The belief that how did Pakistan not know he was there? We assume they know. There's evidence that they know. But the collaboration between Pakistan, between their intelligence agency and the U.S. with respect to ultimately, the raid on that compound.
Yeah, well, I think, like you, I'm perfectly prepared to believe and kind of assume that they provided some support to bin Laden. They would have wanted not to get caught. So when you look at the letters that were captured in that compound and later translated and declassified, bin Laden's writing to his family members. He's worried about them running into Pakistani security services. So he didn't have a phone number he could call to get help, but that doesn't mean he wasn't receiving some support. And there is another scene where he's traveling with one of his wives inside Pakistan after he's fled a U.S. bombing, and there's a policeman in the vehicle with them, according to his wife. So, it's an ambiguous picture. The ISI was very clever. They played it both ways for a number of years. They did cooperate with the CIA immediately after 2001 and participated in the capture of significant al-Qaeda terrorists like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shib, and others. And so for a while, the United States believed they really had changed. And it took a while to understand that, well, yes, but they were willing to arrest foreigners, Arabs, Uzbeks, Chechens, but when it came to the Taliban or Pakistani radicals, they weren't prepared to act in the same way.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know whatever happened to that doctor who did the fake immunizations to get DNA to see if those were Osama bin Laden's children?
I believe he's still in prison. The Pakistanis arrested him as a CIA agent and imprisoned him. And despite efforts by the United States to get him out, someone would have to fact check this. But as of a year or two ago, I believe he was still in prison. I haven't brought myself up to date about it.
Directorate S. That's the title of the book. What is Directorate S?
It's the covert action wing of ISI. So it's the secretive unit inside the already secretive intelligence service that runs operations with the Taliban and like groups, mainly in Afghanistan, but also sometimes in Kashmir.
And so give us a sense of this kind of interplay between the CIA and America and ISI throughout the course of our fighting in Afghanistan. It seems like there were twists and turns where we were in collaboration with one another and then we weren't.
Yeah, no, it's really a spy versus spy kind of story, a little bit like, Moscow in the Cold War, because there were no illusions on either side, the CIA or the ISI, about the trust factor, but there was still some cooperation, as we were talking about. And one reason that the CIA wanted to stay close to ISI was they were still looking for Osama bin Laden and his number two, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and they figured that if anybody in Pakistan knew where those guys were, it was going to be an ISI officer. And one thing the CIA is, particularly good at is trying to get someone in a rival security service to switch sides for money or for some other reason. And so they didn't want to break the relationship because they were looking to get close to ISI officers who they might recruit. And then the ISI officers knew that that's what the Americans were doing, and so they would try to implement these rules. Well, don't socialize with him. You're not allowed to go over to that guy's house. And the tension just built up. And when you get to 2011, and there's a CIA operative in Pakistan named Raymond Davis, who's just driving on his own around a city of Lahore, scouting routes and for meetings with agents, and he thinks he's about to be robbed, and he shoots 2 Pakistanis dead and gets arrested, and then the whole thing just unravels. And and then we kill bin Laden, and in the end, the relationship finally breaks, and there's this kind of bitterness. There's a CIA station chief in that period who goes home with a really serious stomach illness, and he thinks maybe ISI tried to poison him. He's not completely sure, but it really got ugly, and it's a fascinating story of modern espionage in a lot of ways.
The fascinating story is Directorate S, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The author is the Pulitzer Prize-winning Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, Steve Coll. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you very much for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to